Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents A Turning of the Tide by Jean Reinhardt, narrated by Michael Healy. Even if the hopes you started out with are dashed, hope has to be maintained. Seamus Heaney. Chapter 1. Tom Gallagher surveyed the scene around him, making sure none of the other passengers were close by. The steamship carrying him and his younger brother across the Irish Sea was not as crowded as he had expected it to be. Their father warned them before they left home to keep to themselves and confide in no one. "Am I going to die, Tom?" his brother whispered. "Hush now, Patrick. If that were so, do you think Dad would have let me take you away from him?" Tom knelt down to where his brother sat on the wooden deck. As he unbuttoned the midsection of Patrick's shirt, he saw that a patch of fresh blood had seeped through the cotton strips binding his narrow waist. Tom took a fresh wad of clean fabric from inside his jacket and looked around the deck once more. Noticing one of the crew coming in their direction, he quickly pulled his brother's jacket over the red stain. "What ails your friend? Seasick, is he?" The man had stopped in front of them. "Aye, he never was one for boats," replied Tom, looking up. "He says he feels better lying down than walking around." "Well, that may be so, but if he's about to lose his last meal, the crew would prefer it was over the side and not splattered across the deck. He's deathly pale." "I'll be sure he makes it to the side, and if he doesn't, I'll clean the mess up myself. Does that ease your mind?" Tom was getting annoyed. The man gave a grunt and walked away, leaving the coast clear for a fresh wad of cotton to be placed on top of the open gash in the young man's side. "Do I truly look that bad?" "I don't feel sick, Tom. Just weak." "You've lost a lot of blood, Patrick. That's why you're so pale." "If only that old codger knew what a good sailor you are, he wouldn't be at all worried about a mess on his deck." "And if our clothes were made of finer cloth, he would never have spoken to us in that manner," said Patrick. "Be that as it may, but it is talk like that has put you in this condition. You must learn to keep your opinions to yourself. Try to sleep now before we dock. The longer you lie still, the less blood you'll lose." As soon as Patrick closed his eyes, he was asleep. Tom smiled, recalling his parents' laughter at how quickly their youngest child would nod off. A memory came back to him of a time in their home in Carlow before circumstances forced them into the workhouse. Their mother had been late dishing up the supper, and Patrick was rubbing his eyes, struggling to stay awake, in spite of his belly rumbling with the hunger. Their father was chasing his daughters as they squealed around the cottage. Tom's mother had placed a platter of potatoes on the table, and the two little girls ran towards the food. It was then they noticed Patrick asleep, his head resting on the rough wooden surface. He remembered his father putting an arm around his mother's shoulders, and both of them laughing at the snores of their youngest son. That was the only memory of his mother's face Tom allowed himself to carry, the one that blocked out the image of a fever-ridden, starving woman. When the ship docked, Tom helped his brother onto the quayside and left him sitting on the ground against a wall while he sought out some transport. Patrick took in the bustling scene around him. Try as he might, he could not remember the last time they had stood on the dockside in Dundalk. He had been far too young. Even his sister's memories of Ireland were vague, and his older brother refused to talk about it much. It was their father who had related the stories of his homeland to them, trying to keep alive the memory of their mother. That was until he remarried, some years after they settled in England. Whenever Patrick or his sisters inquired about their mother, the subject was changed out of respect for his father's new wife. In time, nobody asked, and the memories began to fade. As the scene around him turned hazy, Patrick heard his brother calling him. He felt strong arms lift him up from the ground, and the blurred image of a donkey and cart appeared in front of him before everything went black. Chapter 2. On seeing two strangers approach her cottage, Maggie leaned out to greet them and realized one was being supported by the other. "Bless us and save us! Come in," she fussed, opening the bottom of the half-door. The day being sunny and fresh, the top part had been left open all morning to air out the cottage. Tom half carried his younger brother in through the doorway and looked around to see where he could sit him down. "Over here, son. Lay him on that bed in the corner." "He looks in a bad way. What ails him?" asked Maggie. "He just needs to rest. Don't worry, it's not fever or anything like that. You're in no danger," said Tom. "Thank goodness for that. Are ye looking for someone, or have ye just taken a long walk in the fresh air?" Maggie was used to visitors coming to Black Rock for the good of their health. "Are ye staying in one of the hotels in the village?" although she doubted that by the state of their clothes. Tom shook his head as he carefully helped Patrick down onto the settle-bed. He felt nervous about telling a total stranger the true purpose of their visit. "Do any of the McGrothers live here?" he asked. "We were told to ask for a Maggie McGrother at this house." "I'm Maggie O'Neill by marriage, but everyone calls me McGrother on account of my brother James. You just missed him by a day. He was here for a week with his wife, but they returned to England yesterday. In fact, I only came back to live in Black Rock myself, not more than a month ago. James and Mary have returned to England to fetch their children. They should be back here in no time. Where have ye come from, son?" "My father is Thomas Gallagher. Do you recall him, Mrs. O'Neill? He's from Carlow, but lives in Yorkshire now." "Please call me Maggie. I can't say that I know your father. Did he live here in Black Rock at any time?" "We lived in one of the fishermen's cottages for a few months with Pat and Annie McGrother. Their nephew James was in England at the time, but his wife Mary was living with them, and a young daughter by the name of Catherine. Am I correct in saying that, Mrs. Maggie?" With an excited cry, Maggie threw her arms around the young man and hugged him tightly. "It was your father, Thomas Gallagher, who painted the name on James's boat, wasn't it?" she asked. Tom nodded. "I helped to repair the nets. Was your brother surprised to find that he was the owner of a boat on his return from England? I remember meeting him on the quayside just before we sailed to Liverpool." "He was indeed, but that's another story. Let me put some water on the boil, and you can tell me how your family is faring across the water." While his brother dropped off to sleep, Tom chatted with Maggie about his sisters and his father and what type of employment they all had. Having slept for half an hour, young Patrick roused himself, but cried out in pain as soon as he tried to sit up. Tom was at his side in an instant. "Here you go, young man." Maggie handed Patrick a cup of hot tea and some bread. "I'm much obliged to you, ma'am, for the rest and the food. I hope I haven't inconvenienced you in any way." "Well, there's manners for you. It's no trouble at all, son. Are you in a lot of pain?" Maggie turned to the older brother. "Do you think he needs a doctor? He's as white as my apron." She looked down at her ash-stained garment and quickly removed it. Tom shook his head and asked if he could close the other half of the door, explaining that what he was about to divulge was for Maggie's ears alone. "Of course you can. You're being very furtive. Anyone would think he had murdered someone." The two young men exchanged nervous glances before Tom knelt beside his brother, opening his jacket wide. Maggie gasped at the sight of the blood-stained shirt and ran to inspect what lay underneath. A gaping wound, 3 inches across and very deep, oozed fresh blood that threatened to drip down onto the blanket on which Patrick lay. "I'll wash that out with some salted water, and we can put a fresh dressing on it for you. But I think you need to see a doctor. That wound is very deep. I'm sure I can see some bone, most likely a rib." "Please, Maggie, please don't tell a soul about this. Can you help him yourself? Isn't that what you want, Patrick?" "I cannot go to a doctor. Will you explain the reason why, Tom?" Patrick had raised himself up on one elbow. The older brother told Maggie that Patrick had been associating with a radical group who were protesting against unsafe work conditions. One night, after a meeting in Sheffield, Patrick and some friends became involved in a disagreement with a group of men who had been following them. Tempers flared, knives were wielded, and before anyone knew what had happened, a member of the rival gang lay dead, and Patrick had a deep stab wound in his side. "Someone helped my brother to get home and left him on our doorstep. Patrick refuses to say who it was or give us the names of the men he was with. This happened 3 nights ago. The police are investigating the death, and my father is afraid that they may come looking for Patrick." "Is there anything to connect you with that night, son?" asked Maggie. Patrick shook his head. "It was only the second time I had attended one of their meetings. Sure, I'm not even a member of the movement. Those men were sent to make trouble. I didn't recognize any of them, and I'm sure they didn't know who I was either." "Well, then, let's be thankful for small mercies, shall we?" said Maggie. "I'm lodging in this house with another woman, Kitty Carroll. Her daughter wed last year and left for America with her husband, so there's only the 2 of us here now. She's down the road visiting a sick neighbour, but when she returns, it will be up to her to decide what we should do with the 2 of ye. How long were you planning on staying in Ireland?" "I will have to take the boat back to Liverpool tomorrow, but I would be much obliged if you could look after Patrick until he's well enough to fend for himself." When Kitty arrived, Maggie told her that Patrick was the son of an old family friend and in Blackrock for the good of his health. Kitty wouldn't hear of the young man fending for himself. She assured him that it would be good to have a man about the place, especially once Patrick had made a full recovery. Early next morning, Tom bade farewell to his brother and the 2 women who had shown them such kindness. As he turned the corner at the top of the road, he looked back to see Patrick standing between Maggie and Kitty. Both women had an arm around the young man who had insisted on going outside to say goodbye. They returned Tom's wave, and as he picked up his pace towards Dundalk, he looked forward to being able to put his father's mind at ease with the news that his youngest son was in good hands. Chapter 3. Catherine sat by the stove and watched as the children played blind man's bluff. Thomas, who was blindfolded, stumbled around the kitchen table that stood in the centre of the parlour. He pretended to sniff out his younger siblings from their hiding places. Mary Ann had opened the door and was ready to run into the street, while Bridget, whose nickname was Briege, and Jamie cowered under the table, clinging to each other in mock terror. "I can smell where you are," Thomas said, reaching out his hands and walking towards Catherine. "When was the last time you bathed? What a stink!" His older sister pushed him away, laughing. "You big fool, Thomas, watch out for the stove." The sound of muffled giggles came from underneath the table, and Thomas quickly spun around, catching Briege as she tried to crawl out. After the usual penalty of a good tickling, Thomas let her go and handed the blindfold over. "Go on outside now and continue the game with your friends," he said, dragging Jamie from his hiding place. As they listened to the shouts and laughter coming from the street, the 2 older siblings sat on their parents' chairs each side of the stove. "They all love you, Thomas, even the neighbours' young ones, but they're afraid of me. I can see it in their faces," Catherine sighed. "Do you think Mary Ann is in fear of her own sister? Or Briege? What about Jamie? Sure, he adores you." "No, the children are merely being respectful. It might help if you wore something a bit less fancy on your visits, though." Catherine looked down at her dress, running her hands over the emerald-green fabric. As a lady's maid, she received all her mistress's hand-me-downs, to do with as she pleased. Her mother and aunts had been delighted to receive the dresses she passed on to them. "You should have seen it when Mistress Eleanor wore it. Full of bows and ribbons it was, and fit to be called fancy. I have to remove all the decoration before I'm allowed to wear it. Now it's just a plain old dress." Thomas stoked up the fire and placed a large black kettle on the hot plate to boil. "I had best not stay much longer. Jane will be expecting me back soon. I'm worried about leaving her alone for too long. She's been ill for most of the day." I still cannot believe that you are a married man and soon to be a father. I hope Jane doesn't have too hard a time. She seems so young, compared to me, that is. Are you happy with your life, Thomas? Asked Catherine. Well, it would have been better for us if we had waited and had the time to save more money, but sure, what's done is done, and I love Jane dearly. It took 2 of us to make the baby, and it will take the 2 of us to raise it. Mr. Feeney has been very good to me and even increased my wages. As long as I can provide for us, I will be content enough with my life. And you, Catherine, are you happy with yours? Catherine stood to make the tea as steam spouted from the kettle. She gave it a lot of thought before answering her brother's question. I'm satisfied with my lot for now, anyway. It would take a very special man to make me give it all up. I have my own room, and I don't work half as hard as I used to. I am free to do as I please most Sundays. Sure, at times I even get to travel with the family. Did you know I was in Edinburgh not more than a month ago? So I take it you won't be moving back to Ireland? Asked Thomas. As she poured tea into 2 cups, Catherine sighed deeply. She had expected her mother to be the one to insist on her leaving her job to return to Black Rock, but it had been her father who was most upset about her decision to remain in England. I told Ma and Da before they left for Liverpool that I had decided to keep my job. I said there would be no changing my mind. You should have seen the look on Da's face. Anyone would think I had died. We always expect Ma to be the one that's more aggrieved, but in truth it's Da we should worry about. He has a soft spot for his children, hasn't he? I hope I'll be the same with mine, said Thomas. They should be back tomorrow evening. I pray the house that Maggie found for them is to Ma's liking, or we'll never hear the end of it. The conversation was interrupted by a loud cry from the street, and then Mary Ann's voice rang out, warning the other children to be careful. Mary Ann has been quite the wee mother to the younger ones, hasn't she? Will your master give you leave to come home when they arrive? Thomas asked. The family are having guests all week, so I may be expected to work next Sunday. I'm sure I can sneak away for a couple of hours one of the evenings, probably when everyone has gone to the theatre. There's a play on in Durham they have been planning on going to. The children ran in from the street, Mary Ann herding them to the table. I had better give these 2 a bite to eat before sending them up to bed, she said. Can we go with you, Thomas? Please, asked Breege. Mary Ann is such a bossy boot. She's worse than Ma. Sorry, love, but not this evening. Jane is near her time and needs peace and quiet. Besides, your sister is doing a fine job taking care of you. Look how well fed you both are. Thomas pinched their cheeks. I'm nearly old enough to leave school, said Breege sullenly, and I'm as tall as Mary Ann. I don't need anyone to mind me. Young Jamie was stuffing bread into his mouth faster than he could swallow it. Mary Ann was a good cook and even better at baking than their mother. You could always get work on the docks, Jamie mumbled, his mouth full. What kind of work could I do there? Asked Breege. I don't know, but I heard Mrs. Cooney talking about Mrs. Halpin's daughter, the one that Ma says we are to stay away from and not even mention her name, that one. Mrs. Cooney said she earns a pretty penny on the docks, and you look stronger than her, Breege. You would be sure to get lots of work there if she does. Breege was horrified and stood up from the table, her face bright red. I'm pouring myself a cup of tea. Does anyone else want one? She asked. Mary Ann grabbed hold of Jamie, threatening to wash his mouth out with soap if he spoke like that again. What did I say? Thomas, help me. Don't leave me with her. I'll be murdered as soon as you're out the door, and I don't even know what I've done. Jamie had a terrified look on his face, but he didn't fool his older brother, who was used to the young boy's dramatics. You'll survive. When you're a bit older, I'll tell you what you said that got you murdered. Thomas smiled. I had best be off now. I'll walk you back, Catherine. It's not that far out of my way. Having said their goodbyes, the 2 older siblings left the house, the sound of Jamie's squeals ringing in their ears. He sounds like a stuck pig, doesn't he? Laughed Thomas. Mary Ann truly is a right little mammy. Ma would be lost without her. Catherine linked her brother's arm, and they walked in a comfortable silence for a long time. "Can I ask you a question, Thomas? But I won't be offended if you prefer not to answer." "Fair enough. What is it you want to know?" "I've been reading a column in Mr. Feeney's paper these past few weeks. Someone by the name of R.E. Rubal writes it. Do you know him?" "I've met him. Why do you ask? Do you want an introduction?" laughed Thomas. "Do I need one, or am I looking at him now?" Thomas wasn't surprised at his sister's observation. She had heard him on many occasions arguing with his parents over his radical views. He knew it was only a matter of time before someone in the family questioned him about the weekly column. Even his uncles, neither of whom could read, regularly bought the paper on account of their nephew's connection with it. Although their political views were far removed from Thomas's, they felt their support helped to keep him in a job. "Keep it to yourself, Catherine. Even Mr. Feeney hasn't cottoned on. Not yet, anyway." "Be careful, Thomas. You have a wife and child to think of. Your heathen beliefs will get you into hot water, mark my words." "I'm an atheist, Catherine, not a heathen." "But don't dare tell Ma I said that. It would break her heart." "Won't you get into trouble yourself with your employers if caught reading such a heathen periodical?" Catherine punched her brother in the arm and laughed. "I have to hide it in my underskirts to get it into the house. It burns very well in the fire, did you know that?" "I'm not surprised, with all those fiery words by R.E. Rubal," replied Thomas. "How did you come up with such an unusual name? Is it from one of your books?" They stopped walking, having reached Catherine's destination. Thomas smiled as he said goodbye to his sister and backed away without answering her question. "Thomas, I won't tell a soul, I promise." "I believe you, Catherine. But I think I'll leave you figure it out for yourself," he shouted back as he turned and ran, his laughter echoing through the still air. Chapter 4. "Are you sorry now that you didn't bring any of your own furniture with you?" asked James. "You will miss your stove too, Mary." "Not a bit. What's here will do us fine. Sure, look what's over there by the fire, a nice big pot and a kettle. Our mattresses and bedding are all that we needed to bring with us. And these, of course." Mary pulled from a cloth bag the 6 wooden bowls she had inherited from James's Aunt Annie. There was a good-sized table against one of the walls, and it was on this that Mary had placed the bags containing all of the family's possessions. The sound of laughter could be heard in the room overhead. James had sent the girls up with their mattresses. "Those two are happy enough to be back, aren't they? And wee Jamie is still outside, running around in the fresh air. I had better go and see what mischief he's getting up to in that overgrown plot we have behind us," said James. Mary stepped in front of the doorway, blocking his exit. "Before you go, tell me truthfully if you are happy enough yourself to be back in Blackrock. You've been so quiet this past week," she said. James put his arms around his wife, assuring her that he was just having last-minute doubts. "You know the way I am, love, a worrier, even when things are going well. I fret over leaving Catherine behind and our Thomas with a young wife and baby to fend for." "I do too, James, but they are both old enough to care for themselves. Did we not raise them to be good people with common sense? But you're not alone with your worries, James. I myself become anxious at the thought of our first grandchild growing up so far away from us. Though she's not yet 1 month old, I miss her sorely." James admitted he felt the same way. Thomas and myself agreed that we should try to meet up in Liverpool a year from now. I had not intended telling you, as I wanted it to be a surprise, so, God willing, we shall see our wee Eliza next spring. "Does that ease your mind, love?" asked James. Mary was delighted with the news, and seeing the look of joy on her face, convinced James he had made the right decision in telling her of his plan. "I am off outside now to that bit of land we have at the back of the house to start digging," he said. "The sooner we get the ground ready for planting, the better. I'll get Jamie to help me. It will tire him out. When Maggie arrived with a pot of stew, Mary almost squeezed the life out of her. She hugged her so tight. They were all hungry, but there wasn't much food left of what they had brought with them on the boat. "Don't thank me too much. There's more bones than meat in that stew. Where's that brother of mine? I have someone I want you to meet." "He's out the back digging. He brought his shovel over on the boat with him. Looked a proper navvy, he did," said Mary. "Who is it you want us to meet? Where are they?" Maggie put her head back outside the door and called to someone. As she stepped inside, a slender young man with fair hair and the palest blue eyes Mary had ever seen crossed over the threshold. "Afternoon, Mrs. McGrother," he said, removing his cap. "Mary, this is Patrick, Thomas Gallagher's son, all the way from Yorkshire." "Paddy Patrick? Or was it not Paddy Patrick you were called by your family?" Mary smiled, shaking the hand held out to her. "Nobody has called me that in years. I'm surprised you remembered." "Have I been calling you by the wrong name then, son?" asked Maggie. "My mother insisted that everyone call me by my full name. Whenever anyone shortened it to Paddy or Pat, she would say, 'Not Paddy, Patrick.' And so that's what I said whenever I was asked what my name was. Even the neighbours began to call me Not Paddy, Patrick, so it stuck." "It's a bit of a mouthful, but if you like it so much we can call you that." Maggie gave a sly smile. Patrick assured the women that there was no need to do anything of the sort. He told them he had been relieved when his brother and sisters dropped the nickname as he got older, only using it when they wanted to annoy him. Mary called the girls downstairs, introducing them to their guest. She sent Breege outside to fetch her father and brother. As James welcomed the young man to his home, Mary dished up the stew into Annie's wooden bowls, and Maggie broke up some bread to be dipped into it. While the men talked, the children ate in silence, too busy devouring their meal. Mary Ann was daintily taking small mouthfuls of bread and chewing it in an unusually ladylike fashion. "What are you nibbling your bread like a wee mouse for, Mary Ann? I hope you're not ailing," said Mary. "There's nothing wrong with showing some manners at the table, is there? Not like those two savages there. You would think they hadn't eaten for a week," said Mary Ann, her face colouring. "Begging your pardon, my lady, do you want us to sit under the table where we can't offend you with our slurping and dribbling?" mocked Breege, who was sitting beside their guest. Patrick was in conversation with James when he felt a sharp kick to his leg. Leaning to one side as he rubbed his shin, he frowned across the table at Mary Ann. "Was that boot meant for me?" asked Breege smugly. Poor Mary Ann's face went beetroot red as she excused herself to run upstairs. James decided it was time to leave the women to settle the children into their beds and asked Patrick if he would care to take a walk. As soon as the men were gone, Mary sent Breege upstairs to apologize to her sister. Jamie was tired from his work in the garden and for once put up no resistance at being sent to bed. "Did you see the way Mary Ann was looking at Patrick? I thought she was going to swoon," said Maggie. "Don't talk such nonsense. She's only a child," said Mary. "She's 15. There are young ones married with a child at that age. I'm telling you, Mary, you had better have a word with her. She's a sensitive wee thing, and I wouldn't like to see her getting hurt." "By who? Patrick? Does that mean you plan on having a word with him too?" asked Mary. "I will if it comes to it, and no better woman to do it. You know I'm a straight talker. The next time Mary Ann is in Patrick's company, take a keen interest in how she behaves, and you'll see for yourself what I'm talking about. Will you do that much at least?" Mary nodded her head, then changed the subject. She didn't want to think about either of her youngest daughters becoming women, especially not Mary Ann. Chapter 5. James received a warm welcome at Paddy Mac's from his old neighbours and fishing mates. They were already acquainted with Patrick, and it was very obvious how well the young man fitted in. "Well, you have certainly settled in here quickly enough," remarked James. "Sure."
Sample complete. Ready to continue?